Kehilat Shalom. So I was looking at the three guys up here just now, and it's clear that I missed a memo somewhere. I didn't realize that the uniform of the day was khakis and a blue dress shirt, and here I foolishly wore blue and yellow, so. Sorry, that's for you guys. My previous congregation was in Norwich, Connecticut, which is a small city, and it was a small congregation, but one of the things that made it interesting on occasion was that the city of Norwich is the seat of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Norwich, which means that there is a bishop of Norwich, and whenever the church needed stuff, they usually called on me, which could be cool and interesting at times. And so one time I got a phone call from their marriage tribunal, which was trying to track down a Beit Din, a rabbinic court in New York City, which had given a get, a Jewish divorce, to a certain couple. Okay, and why does the Catholic Marriage Tribunal need to track down this Jewish rabbinic court? Well, Jewish rabbinic court, I guess that's right, obvious. There aren't any like non-Jewish rabbinic courts, but anyway, so this guy had been married to a Jewish guy, had been married to a Jewish woman. They got divorced. They had to get a Jewish divorce. And now he's engaged to be married to a Catholic woman. And they want to get married in a church. And question is, are they allowed to, right? Because somebody who's been divorced, right, they can't get remarried under Catholic laws. Now, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes when a couple will come to me to get married, and I find out one of them was previously married, and I'll say, you know, was your prior spouse Jewish? And sometimes you don't have, like, people, you ask a question and people are trying to figure out what answer you want, right? And they think I want them to say, yes, my prior spouse was Jewish, right? Because I'm gonna yell at them for like having married a non-Jew, right? Which I don't do, obviously. But in fact, what's the answer I want? No. Right, my previous spouse was not Jewish, because then there's no issue of, well, you have to go to a rabbinic court and do a get, and I can officiate at your marriage, right? But what I found interesting when I started dealing with this, if two Jews get married with a rabbi officiating, as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, that's a valid marriage. Okay, which means that one of those people has an issue if they get divorced and they subsequently want to marry a Catholic, and they want the church to approve of that marriage, right? Because the church doesn't allow divorce, right? But they do allow what? Annulment, right? Now, what is an annulment? Yeah, Dee.
Nullifies the contract and basically presumes that you can have children.
Not necessarily. It nullifies the contract, but why does it nullify the contract?
Because they were married, at least one of them were married under duress.
Under duress or some other impediment to marriage, right? Because a contract to be valid, right, there has to be a meeting of the minds, right? They have to both understand the contract that they are entering. And like, for example, right, if I enter into a contract, Jacob, I enter into a contract to buy a house from you, right? Turns out you don't actually own the house, right? Do I still owe you the money from the contract? No, why not? Right, why didn't I get the house? Right, because you don't own it, right? So that's an impediment to a contract, right? You can't sell me something that you don't own. Okay, so the impediment here would be that one or both of the parties lacked the mental, the psychological fitness to enter into a marriage, right? And therefore you can't contract a valid marriage, and it never existed. And even if they had kids, doesn't matter, right? Because if the partner was not mentally fit to enter into a marriage, kids schmidt, right? Doesn't really matter. So the question that the Catholic Marriage Tribunal had to ascertain is a get the equivalent of an annulment, okay? And that was the end of my involvement. I don't know how it turned out. And to a certain extent, it would also depend on the particular Beit Din, right? Because conservative Batei Din are more likely to grant an annulment and say a get is not necessary, right? I mean, I've had some interesting cases. I don't want to go into it. I mean, I actually would love to go into it, but maybe I'll do a kiddish conversation on this someday, okay? So I don't know how that turned out. Now, there are a lot of laws of marriage and divorce in this parasha. And the first thing in the parasha, again, we didn't read it this morning because it's at the beginning of the parasha and we're in year 2, is what's known as the Yafat Toa. Okay, the Yafat Toa is the beautiful captive woman, right? So you go to war and you see a beautiful woman among the captives and you desire her, bring her into your house, but for 30 days, you can't be intimate with her. She has to shave her head. She has to trim her nails, put on mourner's clothes, and mourn her parents for 30 days. The unspoken assumption here is that her parents were killed in the war, right? And then after 30 days of her living in the house with shaved head and hasn't been able to do up her nails and wearing mourning clothes, and if you still desire her, right then you can marry her. You can marry her. If you later change your mind, you have to divorce her, right? You can't say, well, I married this captive woman and turns out she's a little bossy. I don't like her so much, right? So I'm gonna sell her as a slave, right? No, you can't do it. You have to divorce her and she goes on her way like any other person, right? Which means you can't what? You can't rape a female captive, right? And we know that this is right, it happens today all the time, right? I don't have to go into it. Horrible, horrible stories from October 7th, right? Horrible, horrible stories from women who were hostages in Gaza and then either released or escaped, right? Horrible, horrible stories from Bosnia, from Sudan, from wherever there's a war, right? We know this. And the Torah, 3,500 years ago, says, no, you can't do this. Okay, now, is this progressive? Not exactly. I mean, it's not our standards, right? Because there's nowhere in this passage that says, oh, by the way, the woman has to want to marry you, right? No, it's unilateral, right? But it's still, it's certainly better than being raped or enslaved, right? So, it's pretty progressive for 3,500 years ago, right? And we have a law of divorce in the parasha, right? So, and this is any woman, not just a captive woman who you marry, right? If you find in your wife an ervat davar, then you have to, it says, Vayichtov la sefer kritut, right? He has to write her a bill of divorce, right? And it says he has to write for her. And again, if any of you have ever been involved in some way with a get, right? You get married, you go online, you find a ketubah that you like, right? No, seriously, right? And you find a ketubah that you like, and it's because when we got married, right, we found a ketubah that we liked. It was already, it's a woodcut that all the artist had to do is write in our names, the date, the places, whatever, but and that's most common. Very few people have a ketubah written for them from scratch, right? Because that's fine, but no such thing for a get, for a divorce. Why? Because it says Vayichtov la sefer kritut. He shall write for her a bill of divorce, right? So it has now. Does the husband actually write it out? Not usually, because it's like it's a specialty that you really have to know what you're doing, right? But it's written out on the spot by a scribe. The husband makes the scribe his shaliach, his emissary, and then it's as if the husband had written it out. Okay, so it's very, very common, right? Which means, like, in the entire world, within the conservative movement, there are about 15 or 20 rabbis who are certified to do this. Okay, I'm not one of them. Now, the question is, what does ervat davar mean, right? The word erva, because the word erva appears in our parsha, some other places as well, some sort of sexual immorality. What does the word davar mean? A thing, right? So most translations of ervat davar say an unseemly thing, right? Our translation says something obnoxious, right? But it's two words and one of them is thin, right? So the Gemara debates the meaning of the term. What does ervat davar mean? And Beit Shammai says ervat davar means adultery, right? The only reason that a man can divorce his wife is adultery, right? And this was common in civil law up until very, very recently. Um, like for example, I mean, like in Maryland, the divorce laws changed January 1st of the current year, where you no longer have to prove guilty, right? Or you no longer have to live separately for a certain amount of time. What was it? You had to live separately for 6 months. If you spent one night in the same house, the clock reset. Right now, it's basically, we don't like each other, we don't get along. That's ground for divorce, right? But, and you know, if you look at a lot of evangelicals, right, that they want to change they want to change the laws that the only grounds for divorce is adultery, right? So they follow Beit Shammai. But Beit Hillel reads it very differently. It says, O erva, O davar, right? Either adultery or anything else, right? And then it goes on to say, if he wants to divorce her because she burned dinner, that's grounds for divorce, okay? What do you think about that? Anyone? Jacob?
Hardly appropriate.
What?
Hardly appropriate.
Hardly appropriate. Okay, now let me flip it around, right? Now, right, pretend I'm a woman, all right? My husband wants to divorce me because I burned dinner, right? But the laws follow Beit Shammai, and I have to stay with it. Is that fair? Right? I mean, if your husband wants to divorce you because you burned dinner, better off not being married to him, right? Seems to me, right? Seems to me, I mean, look, I don't know because I do almost all the cooking, you know, right? And the only time, this year was the first time in many years, right? Because we're getting ready for the Pesach Seder, right? And my minhag is to put the shank bone and the egg in the same baking tray in the oven and forget it and incinerate the egg. And this is the first year in many years that I didn't incinerate the egg, right? So if Kelly wanted to divorce me for burning dinner, she really can only do that error, right? Because that's the only thing. But, right, but so on the one hand, yeah, you want to divorce your wife because she burned dinner, pretty harsh, right? On the other hand, my husband wants to divorce me because I burned dinner, and the law says I gotta stay with him. That's pretty harsh too. So, to my mind, if a relationship has broken down, it's broken down, and the people should be allowed to divorce as they are in Judaism because the law follows Beit Hillel. But at the same time, it's not taken lightly either, right? It's cumbersome. There are rules about how the divorce is written. It's on parchment with the same ink and the same quill as a Torah scroll, right? Which is why it's a specialty that requires specific training. And it involves a trip to the Beit Din, the rabbinic court, and either the husband has to physically go to the Beit Din, to the court, or appoint an emissary, right? And that can be done by mail. So I don't see anybody who's been with me, but I have done that, right? If you want if you're in the process of having a get written. And so they come to me and I have to get 2 other men to be witnesses for the appointment of the agent and so on and so forth. And then in the same way, the get itself, the divorce itself has to be presented by hand to the woman. So either she has to go to the Beit Din, or it's also done by an agent, again, the rabbi and 2 other witnesses. And I remember when my father got remarried and I officiated at the wedding, and my father had not given my mother a get. Can't do the wedding unless, I said to the dad, you can't do the wedding unless you give Dad a get. And then he said, all right. And I spoke to my mom and she said, I'll do anything you want as long as I don't have to be in the same room with you. And, because they had a wonderful relationship after they got divorced. And not a problem. My dad went to the Beit Din at JTS. They sent the get to Rabbi Rossov of blessed memory in Rumson. My mom went to Rumson to get the get, and it was all done. Okay. The last thing I want to mention, there is a saying in Proverbs, Eshet Chayil, Sheker hachen vehevel hayofi. Grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, which means marriage has to be based on more than physical attraction. Right? Contrary to a lot of, frankly, American pop culture, and increasingly American pop culture is the world pop culture. And for this reason, you know, and a lot of you know, I sometimes have a taste, perhaps an unhealthy taste, for rather lowbrow television. And Kelly and I have watched every episode of every version of Love is Blind. And if you're not familiar with Love is Blind, it's on Netflix, and I'm not going to describe the whole thing, but men and women are chosen and they meet each other. They're sitting in cubicles and they can't see the other person, and they have meeting, and they decide, without ever having seen each other, and you're not allowed to describe your physical attributes, to get engaged. And then they get engaged, and then they spend 30 days together, 30 days. I mean, the woman doesn't have to shave her head, but they spend 30 days together, and at the end of 30 days, do they still want to get married or not? And we've watched all 6 seasons of Love is Blind. We've watched Love is Blind UK, Love is Blind Sweden, 4 seasons of Love is Blind Brazil, and Love is Blind Mexico. And I don't think I've left any of them out yet. But it's really fascinating because the underlying sort of conceit is we want to see if people can legitimately fall in love without, you know, the question of physical attraction. Now, I have to say that all of the people chosen for the show are conventionally attractive, right? Not necessarily gorgeous, right? But there's never been a contestant who was like, as they would have said on Seinfeld, undated, right? There hasn't been any such contestants, so it's it would be really interesting but anyway. And some of them do get married, and in one case, was a couple that I thought never would make it. And it's like a Texas cowboy and a very wealthy Israeli American from Los Angeles. And they got married and they have a kid. And, you know, by all intentions, they seem to be quite happy with each other, but the idea that marriage has to be based on more than physical attraction, not the same thing as saying no physical attraction. The Torah doesn't think that's unimportant, but it's not the only thing that's important. And as much as I'm into pop culture, I think it's important because one of the things that I think my job is to sort of explain Judaism in light of contemporary culture and explain contemporary culture in light of Judaism. But Love is Blind, to the extent that it's successful, says the same thing, right? Sheker and behevel hayilfi, grace is deceitful and beauty is vain. And our Judaism, one of the challenges of being a conservative Jew is we live in contemporary culture, but at the same time, we can be critical of it and not embrace it, you know, uncritically when it seems it's kind of off the track. Shabbat Shalom. And we continue with the Kaddish before Musaf, Musaf service, page 155 in the Shabbat Siddur 428 in the full Siddur, and then we proceed to Musaf, we'll say the first two pages.